Well, let me begin then by saying that I am very, very pleased to be here. I have been looking forward to this from the moment that Janusz mentioned this conference to me, and just really excited by the talks that I've heard, the things that are being discussed, the ideas that are being exchanged. This is really a wonderful event to be part of. So I hope that you can hear me okay and see the slides that I have for you. Today I'd like to talk about forgiveness, especially in relation to how it might be part of the solution to the rising levels of just outright hatred that we are experiencing in our world today. I really hope that you can take away something useful from today's talk. And if you'd like to be in touch with me at the end of my talk, I'll give you my contact information in the event that there are any questions. I direct the Laboratory for the Investigation of Mind, Body, and Spirit at Luther College, where I'm a professor of psychology. I'm also the president of the Forgiveness Foundation, as well as I am the chair for the Discover Forgiveness Advisory Council for the Templeton World Charity Foundation. I'm going to share with you a little bit of each of those things here in the talk that I'm going to present here today. So I want to start by asking the question, what exactly is hatred? Because that's the thing that we're trying to address. And so when we think about exactly what hatred is, it can be defined in many different ways. And a recent review of research on hatred identified 56 different definitions of hatred. Out of those 56 definitions, 27 of them, or almost 50%, defined it as an emotion. It's not exclusively an emotion. It can include attitudes and behaviors and things that lead to prejudice and discrimination, of course. But at its core, hatred is an extremely negative emotion. And often it comes with a desire for harm to another, or at least an intent to act aggressively toward another individual. And hatred can be expressed both on an interpersonal level, one that is between, say, just you and me, or it can be expressed at what we call an intergroup level, and that is between communities, between societies, between nations. So hatred really breeds violence because of this incredible negativity, the desire to act aggressively, and ultimately to want to see harm done to others. And so for that reason, I see it as an antithesis to peace. Well, oftentimes people consider two options in addressing hatred. To remove hatred, often we turn to something that you all are familiar with and have been discussing some already in this conference, and that is the notion of justice, setting the scales of justice in a balanced fashion is often one way of dealing with the hatred that is expressed between one group and another. But often an overlooked response to hatred and to aggression and violence is forgiveness. And I want to be clear about what I'm talking about when it comes to forgiveness, because oftentimes in this discussion, people are confused about what it is that I'm thinking about. And so we'll start by saying justice and forgiveness are two things, but they're really two different things. And a good deal of research has gone into illustrating just how different they are. And so many people can relate to not experiencing forgiveness. Someone does something hateful toward you and you can't forgive them. And on the other end of that spectrum is something that we can all likely relate to as well, and that's the experience of complete forgiveness. And while we think of those things as, two ends of the spectrum, oftentimes people get justice confused, and they think that somehow if you forgive someone, you don't have to get justice, or you can't get justice. And I'd like to argue here today that justice is an independent construct. It's an independent idea. And of course, you can get no justice. You can get very little justice, or you can get complete justice. And again, we can all probably relate to those different experiences, right? Where you've gotten justice and felt really good about it, or when you didn't get any justice and you really felt like someone got the better of you. And so the point here this morning is to say that these things intersect and they create four different experiences. One is where you get justice and you're able to forgive. And you might think of, situations in which communities or countries have, appropriate reparations have been made, justice has been done, and forgiveness follows in some way. But often we find that there's no justice and there's no forgiveness. And that is a breeding ground for hatred, because people really feel like nothing has been done that should have been done. However, sometimes we get justice and we still are not able to forgive. And we see that around our present world in many different places today, where many of us might wonder or think that maybe justice has been done, maybe things are about as fair as they can be, and yet people are unable to forgive and move beyond their hatred. And finally, sometimes we don't get any justice, but people are able to forgive. And so even though they haven't gotten the reparations, or maybe things have not been handled in an equitable and praiseworthy way, and yet these individuals are still able to forgive. And so I'd like us to think about, hatred in our hearts, hatred in our homelands, hatred for others in other homelands, and think about the four different options that are available, and know that in some cases justice will be done, and that will probably help people forgive. In other cases, it will not be done, and it might be an obstacle to forgiveness. But these two things are not necessarily dependent on each other. You can do one without the other. And that's what I'd really like to suggest today, is that it doesn't always require justice to forgive. And so in order to better understand that, we have to consider that justice is something that can certainly help forgiveness, because oftentimes it helps to provide for those lower level needs in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That is to say, justice oftentimes ensures some degree of physiological needs that are being provided for: food and water and shelter and warmth on a cold November day. Safety needs, security from threat from others, whether that be terrorist acts or bombings by other adversaries. And so justice can kind of support those lower level needs, whereas forgiveness is something that probably rises higher in Maslow's hierarchy and belongs in kind of the love and esteem and self-actualization categories. But that means that oftentimes forgiveness is likely to be a slightly less powerful motive. If you remember Maslow's theory, his hierarchy of needs says that those base needs are very powerful, and hence the reason why the need for justice is so strong for so many of us. And forgiveness is a nice motivation that many of us would like to entertain. It's just kind of harder to develop the strength of that motivation because it lies higher in the hierarchy, which means it engages higher levels of our development. Now, the one thing I want to be clear before we go any further here is to say that forgiveness is not like a prescription for medication. You cannot say that someone should forgive and that's all they need to do and then all of our problems would be fixed. If they could just drop their hatred and forgive their wrongdoers, everything would be fine. That might be true, but we can't prescribe forgiveness. In other words, we can't just say forgiveness is something you must do and then that will fix the rest of our problems. It just doesn't work that way. Forgiveness is something that is very much, some people have argued it is the fullest expression of love. And for those philosophers and theologians in the room, I know that you know that love cannot be taken. It cannot be prescribed. It is not something that you must do. It is only something that you can give. So that makes this a very difficult equation. It's something that can only be given, but the motivation to give it sometimes is not very strong. But let's be clear, forgiving other people involves letting go of the negative thoughts or feelings or motivations to hurt someone and replacing those things with positive thoughts and feelings and motivations. And so, at its simplest level, forgiveness is perhaps simply the replacement of hatred with love and forgiveness. And at very minimum, forgiveness is releasing negative emotions, releasing hatred towards someone. So what happens when you do forgive? Well, some of the things that we know from the research that we've done over the last 20 or so years is that forgiveness has a wonderful benefit for your mental health. It has, which I'm illustrating here, it has benefits for happiness. It has benefits for spirituality. It has benefits for quality of life. And ultimately, it has benefits for your physical health and your longevity. That is, how long you're expected to live. Well, it turns out that people who have low levels of forgiveness, when they encounter stressful circumstances, those stressful circumstances often lead to compromised mental health. And that's one of the strongest relationships we see in psychology, is that stress leads to poor mental health. And for people that have low levels of forgiveness, that's very true. For people who have even moderate or medium, kind of middling levels of forgiveness, stress is also connected to poor mental health and depression. But for people that have high levels of forgiveness, we find an interesting thing here, and that's that stress is no longer connected to depression. It is as if forgiveness is providing a protective barrier from stress, from life stressors on your mental health. And that is something that we find to be very relevant as we think about the implications of forgiveness. Forgiveness might be able to protect us from the negative outcomes of experiencing bad things in life that create a lot of stress for you. And that could be, it could protect you from mental health or any of the other things that I mentioned. Maybe it protects you from aggressive desires. Maybe it protects you from hatred towards someone or some other group. It has a protective advantage And you might even suggest it has a protective advantage for adaptation and survivability, that people who are able to forgive are able to enjoy a better quality of life, and that better quality of life is something that then allows them to live longer and more peacefully, and hopefully then even live in a more peaceful society. So I want to be clear here that forgiving other people is really only about it's really only about half the equation. When many people think about forgiveness, they think about multiple things. And forgiving yourself is one of those things that people think about. I think that's a very common thing today in many Western societies and cultures, is to consider the importance of self-forgiveness. And today, many people are really very interested in doing just that. However, what I would suggest here today is that self-forgiveness is probably something that should be a definite second priority. If you're faced with forgiving other people or forgiving yourself, the thing you probably want to do first is forgive other people. And the reason why is that self-forgiveness is about many of the same things that forgiveness is about. It's about thinking less negatively about excuse me, thinking less negatively about yourself, thinking more positively about yourself, feeling more positive emotion, and having a better sense of who you are. It is, in a sense, replacing self-hatred with self-love and self-forgiveness. And at bare minimum, it is letting go of self-hatred. However, a couple things that we need to distinguish here is that self-forgiveness is not self-compassion. Self-compassion is just being kind to yourself. And there are many circumstances in which you should indeed be kind to yourself. I have the example, and this is a common example in the United States that people say often: everyone has a bad hair day. And when you do, you should probably not, you should not beat yourself up too much, because it happens to everybody, and it's just one of those things about life. You shouldn't be so self-critical. That's not really what self-forgiveness is. Self-forgiveness is recognizing that you have done something wrong. And if you've done something wrong, the problem is that you're likely to engage in a sense of narcissism, meaning a kind of self-centeredness about what you've done. It is also something that David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, says is risky because you engage in moral individualism. And that is that you turn only to yourself. I believe his recent book is called Moral Selfism, the Gospel of Saint You. And that is to say that you are the only one that determines what is right or wrong for you. And again, many of you in the conference today can probably see the problem with this, that if we rely only on ourselves to determine what is right and wrong, our ego is going to get in the way. We are going to see ourselves as being virtually perfect people. And that is a very difficult thing for us to see correctly. When it comes to me, I have a very hard time understanding that I can be faulty and I can be, broken, and I can do things that hurt other people. So, the important thing here is to keep in mind that when it comes to self-forgiveness, if we've done something wrong, we need to do something right. That is, we need to fix the problem. And by fixing the problem, I mean, we should try to, in some way, make amends. In some way, make restitution for the wrongdoing that you have committed. This is not an easy thing to do when you have wronged someone. You would probably like to ignore it. You would like to assume that what you did was not as bad as you think, and that you probably did not hurt someone. And you can probably come up with all kinds of defense mechanisms that will make you feel better, but will not actually address the problem. And that is the root problem with self-forgiveness, is it's too easy to offer it in a disingenuous way. So as we think about hatred in our hearts, hatred in our homelands, my suggestion would be that we think first and foremost about forgiving others, trying to make things right with those who have hurt us, and not focus so much on trying to make ourselves feel better through self-forgiveness. Now, at some point in time, self-forgiveness may be appropriate and may be an important aspect of healing. I just want to encourage the thinking that it could be a second priority, and it would be just fine as being second in line. So what we're kind of focusing on here today is forgiveness and how it is an adequate response to hatred, and how this can help both within our own individual hearts but also within our homelands. And when we expand this concept of forgiveness to the broader community, this is where things get really interesting. We might think of community forgiveness, kind of what we might call societal forgiveness. And how do we move entire groups of people, entire cultures? How do we educate them in ways that make forgiveness not just an option, but maybe it is a primary option? It is something that people maybe consider first, not last. And so when we think about the nature of community injustices, whether it be in the Middle East currently, whether it be in Ukraine presently, whether it be somewhere else in the world that is facing enormous conflict and violence, every community, every culture, every nation is different. And we need to take those differences into account when we're thinking about how we can encourage and educate for forgiveness. Some communities experience what you might think of as, somewhat minor offenses. Others might have incredibly severe, life-threatening events that are happening. So it's always important to know that community injustices, offenses that might need to be forgiven, hatred that is swelling up, is occurring in a place and a time, and it's also occurring in the context of history, where in some cases people have been oppressed or hated or treated unjustly for decades or even longer, centuries. So I want to mention just a couple of examples of things that we have attempted to do, and want to also maybe mention that, as I said at the outset, I am a psychologist, and so we focus on the science of psychology and the extent to which we can educate people using what we've learned, the extent to which we can educate people about forgiveness. So at its kind of broadest level, this is a community forgiveness effort that, while it is interesting to know that people can forgive, they can forgive others, they can forgive themselves, and that's good. We'd really like to know, to what extent can a community start to feel more forgiving toward some other group, or some other injustice that has befallen them. And one of the first things that we did in this regard is we evaluated a community forgiveness intervention that we did at Luther College here in Iowa in the United States. And this was one of the very first times anyone had attempted something like this. And so we really didn't know what to expect. We did our best. We created all kinds of educational opportunities. These things involved things just as simple as writing assignments in classes, things that students would do in their social spaces, like we created kind of a community bulletin board for forgiveness. We had some kind of specifically organized talks that were given around forgiveness. The student newspaper ran some stories on forgiveness. And we essentially tried to educate in as broad a way as possible our entire campus community. Now, keep in mind, Luther College is not, it's not a really big place, but nonetheless, it was about 2,700 students and 600 employees at the time that we did this. So that's a fairly sizable group of people, and certainly isn't something that we're going to be able to, address in just getting people into one room and kind of teaching them about forgiveness. So our question was, can we use any of these kind of mass educational activities that were really focused on impacting the whole community, the whole group of us? Can we use any of those things to move people in a more forgiving direction? And sure enough, what we found out, we measured levels of forgiveness across time. And as it turns out, we measured them across the entire academic year. And what we found out is that when we compared our baseline measures of forgiveness to our post-community intervention measures, we found that people increased in their levels of forgiveness. They were treating each other with more love and kindness, treating their roommates more kindly, treating their friends more kindly, their professors, and so forth. And so we were encouraged, we were encouraged to find that this community intervention actually had impact. It changed. We delivered this education to the entire community, not to any one single person, but the entire community. We didn't know necessarily who had received the education and who hadn't. But in the end, it ended up moving people in a more forgiving direction. And that's what we were hoping for. And some of you may be familiar with an online magazine called The Greater Good magazine. It's a magazine that's published out of the University of California, Berkeley Greater Good Science Center. And they did a short story that I have clipped here at the bottom of the screen on how to build a more forgiving community. And so for those of you that might want to Google that, it's an easy way to access the results of our study and to get a little bit of a sense of what we did.
Loren, we would have
now, some of you might be
stop.
thinking, well, that's very interesting, but honestly, how much do students at Luther College need to forgive, and how much is this community really in need of forgiveness? And for many of you, that would be a
Loren, there
legitimate
is a question. We are out of the time
colleges
slowly.
and universities. You might say, in general, these students are not in great need. But so to test that possibility and to see if the techniques that we had developed would work in a more challenged culture, we took this to Colombia.